Hi, welcome everyone to Behind the Pulpit. This is our first Sunday of Lent. You might notice I'm wearing the ever beautiful purple. As we prepare, as this time of preparation, as we move towards Easter, preparing ourselves for that great mystery and revelation of God's truth and plan of reconciliation on that Easter Sunday. And so today is actually Ash Wednesday, and a number of you are going to be at worship services for that. And and it's a time when we prepare ourselves. Oftentimes, many people will give up something. Our family is going to try to actually add something that we can do every day to remember God and everything that He's done for us, and to prepare ourselves for that coming of Easter. And so, I encourage you to all take some time in prayer and see what God is leading you to, how He would like you to prepare for the resurrection of His Son, Jesus Christ, and His ascension. And entering into the lordship of all of our lives. And so it's a really special time, this season. So as I said, this is our first Sunday of Lent, February 14th, also Valentine's Day, which many of you know. And so what we're going to do is open up with Psalm 91. This is a great psalm that talks about how we find shelter in God, and how God is our refuge. It also has that beautiful line, which we won't have in our call to worship, but there is a verse, I believe it's verse 2, that talks about abiding under the shadow of God's wings. There's a lot of times in which there's a metaphor that's used by God to be some kind of bird, whether it's a bird of prey or, as Jesus would say in the Gospels, as a hen gathering chicks. This idea of the wings of God and abiding in the shadows of those. And so it's a good reminder that as we enter into Lent, that God is our shelter and our refuge, that no matter what happens during this time, we can rely upon Him. And so we're going to sing a hymn that builds off of that psalm. Our opening psalm is, "Under His wings I am safely abiding." Again, just playing with that idea and reminding ourselves that God has us and God has care of us, no matter what happens, that we can have trust in Him. And then for a responsive reading, it's a responsive reading on the back of our hymn book, Sin and Forgiveness, that talks about the relationship between the two. A lot of times Lent is a preparation of the ways in which we have failed God, or the sins in which keep us from God's full glory that we have within ourselves, and how forgiveness works in that during this time as God prepares us. So I've talked a lot about during Lent how we prepare ourselves, but God also prepares us. And so this is a nice responsive reading to reflect that. And so as our hymn of confession, we're going to be singing "I Need Thee Every Hour," a really popular, famous hymn that really emphasizes how every day of every hour of every minute we need God, and how we should be constantly and continually in prayer so that God can prepare us. Not just that we prepare ourselves, but that God can indeed prepare us. So since this is the first Sunday of Lent, one tradition that we often have in the church is to preach upon the gospel lesson of Jesus. Sometimes we call it the temptations of Jesus. I prefer the word testing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of Luke and Luke's account. I love Luke's account because of how it ends, and we're going to talk about that as it relates to the sermon. But I would like to point out that the temptation accounts in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew are slightly different, and when Jesus goes out into the wilderness. And what I mean by that is that with Luke, we're going to get the sense that the Holy Spirit is guiding him into the wilderness for this time of preparation and testing that Jesus is about to enter into. Matthew, Mark's a little different. You get the sense that the Holy Spirit drives, provokes, pushes Jesus into the wilderness. Now, I don't know about you, but I've experienced both in my lifetime, and I'm assuming I'll continue to experience it in my journey with Christ and His discipling of me, that there are times in which I am gently guided or suggested, and other times when God just simply has to kick you in the rear to get you where you're going. And so all three of those gospel accounts of Mark, Matthew, and Luke of that time of temptation give you different flavors of how the Holy Spirit's interacting with Jesus and how He goes into the wilderness. But as I said, this is a time that we talk about the temptation of Christ, and we get that famous scene in Luke of Satan, or the devil, or Hasatan, the adversary, coming into Christ at his most vulnerable time. Remember, Christ hasn't eaten for 40 days. He's been in the wilderness by himself for 40 days. And how he's tempted by three different questions, and it's amazing to see how Christ responds, how Jesus responds to those questions as he's prepared for his ministry. But as I said before, we say temptation. I don't like that word as much. I think because our modern uses of temptation is that it's something within us. Really the role of Satan in this part, remember, Satan, the Hebrew word hosatan, means the adversary. You might remember over the summer we did a preaching series just on Job and talked about that role of adversary, of testing. And I like testing better because temptation makes it sound like, oh, it's something I really want, but I should say no to. Testing is a little different. Testing is to test your character, is to test your commitment, to test your knowledge. And true testing happens in times when we're vulnerable, times of crisis, times when not everything's going our way, are those crisis points. And I think that's important because as some of you know, or many of you know at this point, that I used to be a college professor, and I still teach classes here and there, and really enjoyed it. And I remember how much stress students would have going into a testing situation. And as a professor, we try to eliminate that. But it's really interesting because you would always have people that say, well, I studied and I didn't do so well, or other people that kind of struggle are like, I just have a lot of anxiety around tests. Well, frankly, that's part of the testing process, because you really don't know if you know something unless you're tested. And a lot of times that test has anxiety connected to it, or crisis, where the rubber meets the road. In other words, a lot of times we say, I know it, but then when push comes to shove, sometimes we don't. And so here's Jesus at a completely vulnerable situation. He's by himself. He's been by himself for 40 days in the wilderness, not sure how he spent that time. We know he hasn't eaten. We know he's been fasting. We know he's been in prayer. But we do know that here he is at a crisis point, an anxiety-induced point, a stress point. And that is when the adversary comes in to test us, to test our character, to test our commitment, to test our knowledge, to test our reliance upon God. And what's really interesting, and this is where the sermon is really going to focus this time around, is that at the end of this Luke account, we have this phrase in which Satan removes himself until an opportune time. In other words, Satan appears right when Christ is vulnerable, and it says that Satan's going to return. Satan, the adversary, is going to come back and test at an opportune time. So what is that opportune time? Well, I'm sure it's another time of crisis, another time of anxiety, another time of stress. And so we're going to look at what are those opportune times in which we are tested, in which the adversary comes and pushes us. We see that with Job. I already referenced it once, and that was our sermon series this summer of looking at Job. Job was at a testing point. He was at a stress point. And here's Jesus at a stress point. And so the question becomes, that comes before us is this: what does our faith look like when nothing's going our way? What does our faith look like when we're down? What does our faith look like when we're deep? One of the teachings that we had at Muskingum Valley Presbytery was this idea that in order to truly heal and live into the empowered life, we have to drop down and deep into who we are and really be honest about all the lies and have it all removed, and then Christ can rebuild us back up. So Satan has opportune times, but here's the other thing. God is with us during those times of testing. That's what we talk about in Psalm 91. That's why we sing, I need thee every hour. That's why we talk about sin and forgiveness. That's why we're under his wings, and I am safely abiding, that first hymn that we're going to sing, that when the adversary is testing us, God is there because it's his opportune time as well. It's not just Satan testing you, but God is with you through Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. And a lot of times, in those opportune times when we are tested, God is fully present as well. We just have to trust and keep our eyes wide open and pay attention, stay awake, be on guard. and pay attention to what God is doing in our lives. And that's why the closing hymn that we have, I have to be honest, I was a little surprised we had this in our hymn book. We're going to sing a hymn that was made famous, that was written and composed by Andre Crouch. Some of you may know him. He appeared with Billy Graham, and he has a wonderful testimonial and a really well-known gospel singer in sort of that sort of evangelical world and revival world. But we have his song Through It All in our hymn book, and I thought it was really perfect because God is truly with us through it all, through the good times, the bad times, everything in between, because every time for God is an opportune time to show his love, to show his care, to help grow us, to guide us, to shepherd us, so that we may be daughters and sons of the Most High. And so through it all, that is the hymn that we will sing and close through, that God is with us through it all. Every time is an opportune time for God. Well, God bless everyone on your Lenten journeys this season, and I look forward to seeing you all in worship this Sunday. Thank you, and God bless.